All right, so in the book 1984, there's a concept called wrongthink. Now, for a Christian like myself, the idea of wrongthink, it just kind of sounds, well, like morally wrong, like it's greed or lust or inner envy or jealousy or hatred or something like that. But that's not what we mean when we talk about engaging in wrongthink. And in fact, I'm going to argue here in this video that wrongthink is actually a very Christian thing to do. Well, where do we get the term and what does it actually mean? Well, obviously the term comes from the book 1984. It's a dystopian novel in which there is a big brother government that has total control on absolutely everything. Big brother government has control on the economy, people's personal lives, even down to the way that they think. And when a person thinks in a way that challenges the narrative according to big brother government, well, they've committed the crime of wrongthink. And again, I'm going to argue that you should actually probably be engaging in more wrongthink than you currently are. Okay, so wrongthink, again, it's not a moral category. It's, though, a rational category of challenging the kinds of narratives, facts, and ideologies that are constantly shoved in your face by perhaps government or Hollywood or the media. You know, part of the problem here in all of this is that we used to live in a day in which the media did its job of challenging authority. Back when I grew up, you could count on the media to ask really hard questions to the leaders as such. You could trust them to challenge the kind of narratives that were given. If an act took place, let's say the assassination of JFK or something like that, there was the media hopefully there to ask really hard, rigorous, challenging questions. In fact, it used to be that politics and media had something of an adversarial relationship, and that was actually a good thing. It was a healthy thing because it was the media's job to question, to deeply question, to rationalize, to challenge, and to think deeply about the kinds of ideologies that were pushed, again, either by Hollywood or by the government. But unfortunately, what happened today, we live here in 2024, is that government, media, and Hollywood all have coalesced around the same ideas. And what that means is that the average citizen had better learn to engage in some wrongthink very quickly. Otherwise, he or she is going to get swept up into a lot of lies and falsehood that are presented to us from the powers that be. Now, when I mean wrongthink, let me try to define this a little bit more precisely. Wrongthink is a way of challenging three informal fallacies that most people commonly fall for. So hopefully you're aware of some of the formal and informal fallacies if you've ever taken a class on logic before, but assuming you haven't, there's three fallacies that most people fall for, and they have some Latin names, so let me just give them to you. The first one is called ad populum. The ad populum error is the error of thinking that something is right merely because many people, perhaps even the majority of people, believe it. But of course, that's not true. So whenever you hear a politician argue that most people believe this, or many people, or more than half, or 75% or 80% of people believe such and such, you should not consider that to be rationally persuasive because, in fact, many times the majority is dead wrong. And for those of us who are Christians, it really doesn't matter how many people believe a certain thing to be true, let's say in relation to sex or gender or fornication or something like that. It really doesn't matter what the poll numbers say because the ad populum fallacy suggests that, of course, the majority can and very often is wrong. So the first thing about being a good wrong thinker is to be aware of the ad populum fallacy. No sorts of arguments should be convincing to you if the main argument, the force of the argument, the thrust of the argument is that most people believe such and such a thing. Okay, the second fallacy you want to be aware of is one called ad baculum, and that's the Latin meaning under threat. Okay, so anytime you're threatened by a certain thing, let's think back to perhaps COVID when we were all threatened with disease and death, and we were told that we were supposed to believe this certain amount of facts and we were engaged in these kinds of behaviors. Otherwise, we were all going to die and we were going to kill grandmother. Well, that was essentially the ad baculum formal fallacy, informal fallacy. Now, sometimes threats are real and they're dangerous, and we should be very careful about them. I tend to look both ways when I cross the street, and I think that's a pretty rational thing to do. But you have to be aware of the fact that a lot of times authorities use veiled threats in order to induce cowardice and fear in our lives, and therefore to try to co-opt us into the way of thinking that that authority wants us to. And so you have to be very aware that anytime you're hearing a threat either implied or expressed, you should actually challenge that notion and ask, why are they threatening me with this thing? The third fallacy that you do have to be aware of, besides ad populum and ad baculum, is Ad verecundium, again, the Latin meaning appeal to authority. We know because we know. We are the experts. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Crest toothpaste because they're expert in teeth and you know nothing about teeth, and so you should trust them. Same thing too with professors or senators or the authorities that be, whoever they are. Anytime we're appealing to a general sense of authority because they know better than you, well, you should challenge that. And we hear this all the time, especially recently when we were told to trust the science or trust the scientists, or this guy is the embodiment of science, or whatever it is. So ad populum, ad baculum, and ad verecundium appeal to popularity, appeal to force, and appeal to authorities that know better than you. These are always things that should trigger some kind of bells in us so that we might be willing to engage in wrong think. Now, let me tell you how to be a better wrong thinker. In fact, I'm going to give you six tips that I think are going to be wise for you. First of all, you should always challenge both sides of the argument. In other words, you should challenge both parties. Now, unfortunately today, don't we? We live in a day that is highly bifurcated into two polarities, generally expressed as the Democrats and the Republicans. But here's the problem. You don't need to choose one of those two things. That, of course, is another kind of fallacy. It's a false dilemma fallacy that you either need to be in this camp or that camp. The fact of the matter is that there are other ideas, there are other conclusions that you can arrive at. And so you have to be very, very careful that you don't isolate yourself into one of those two camps. And unfortunately, everything in our culture says that you need to be either on this side or that side, okay? But, of course, it is possible to be standing in your own place, and perhaps you may be standing against the whole world, but you may be the only one who's actually right in that given situation. Second of all, we should subject every single claim to a critical analysis. Whenever we hear something from an authority, we should regard it for what it is, of course, but we should also be willing to challenge that thing. I've heard it said, and I think I kind of like this rule, that any argument that is presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And so, in other words, if a person isn't willing to try to do all of their homework to convince you of their conclusion, you certainly don't need to jump to that conclusion to follow it just because they said so. Third, you have to be aware of your own confirmation bias. Now, this is true for every single one of us. We all think of ourselves as being very rational and objective thinkers. We like to think of ourselves as free thinkers. We like to think of ourselves as being free from the pressures of intellectual conformity. But the fact of the matter is, probably all of us are motivated by certain kinds of biases. And typically, when we prefer a certain argument because we like it or because we grew up with it, we tend to find those kinds of arguments that support that said argument to be more persuasive than others. But this too is dangerous, and all of us should be open to rational persuasion given that the facts actually support the conclusions that they are suggesting. And so the next point I would say is that you should be open to be persuaded, but cautiously so. You should challenge every notion, but you should be the kind of person that can actually be persuaded if the right amount of evidence is given to you to believe that particular thing, but don't accept it without evidence. More than that, you should also assume that you can and have erred in the past, and you probably are making some mistakes in the present as well. None of us have completely perfect worldviews. None of us are omniscient. None of us have all things comprehended in our minds. And what that means simply is that not only have you probably made mistakes in the past, and when you identify them, you should correct them, but that there's probably a few things in your worldview that need to be corrected even now. Again, none of us has a perfect perspective on all things. Only God has a totally complete knowledge of all things and a perfect perspective on reality. So how then do we conform our intellectual worldview to that of God? Well, the only way to do that, of course, is through Holy Scripture. And when we come to the Bible is, of course, the revealed word of the perfect knowledge of God. The Bible is where we are informed about reality is, what God is, what he is like, what he has done for mankind, the condition that we're in, what it means to be truly human, what it means to be sinners. Even those that have rational faculty error problems because we are sinners. So we should be persuaded by Holy Scripture. And that means that when we read Holy Scripture has the perspective to correct us on three things. One, fact. It can correct us on fact. Two, on reason. The Scripture can actually teach us how to think better. And third, it corrects our emotions. Whenever I find myself emotionally reacting to a biblical passage, I should probably assume that I'm wrong and that the Scriptures is right. And so anytime it comes to something like the environment or COVID or gender and sexuality, we should engage, I think, in the very healthy prospect of wrong think, so that we can challenge the narratives that are given to us by Hollywood, by the government, and of course by the media, so as to be more fully formed in our Christian worldviews that are, of course, undergirded ultimately by Holy Scripture. All right, hope that helped. Thank you so much for checking into this video. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.